Great. Thank you, Simone. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I'm really excited that we're able to share our findings, some of our findings today, and to learn from our colleagues who are going to be talking about some of the LGBTQ2S plus inclusion practices. So as Simone said, I am Michael Woodford. I am also a faculty member here at Laurier. I'm an associate professor of social work. I use he, him pronouns. So it's certainly my pleasure to present some of the findings from our provincial study, LGBTQ2S plus Campus Climate, the Thriving on Campus study. In addition to Simone, we also have Zach Marshall from McGill, who's part of the research team, and we have several other people who are part of that. We work with a large number of students, and we also have some wonderful community collaborators. So in terms of the study, there are two broad aims, and those are certainly for us, we want to try to better understand the experiences, the resilience, the well-being, and the academic development of diverse LGBTQ2S plus students throughout the province. And secondly, we're doing that to inform policies and practices so that policies and practices can be better tailored to the diverse needs and strengths of students. When we think about this being an Ontario-based study, we believe that certainly the findings are quite relevant to our province here, but also have applicability beyond Ontario, and certainly the inclusion strategies we're going to learn about today that are featured in the upcoming presentations are going to be quite valuable, I think, in Ontario and beyond. So in terms of some project highlights, one of the things is that for campus climate research in general, it's emerging in Canada. When we think about the growing attention to sexual violence, for example, on campuses. However, when it comes to studies that focus specifically on LGBTQ2S plus populations, there are very few of them in the Canadian context. There's a much stronger research base in the US. For us, though, we're trying to add to certainly our understanding here in Ontario and Canada, but also adding more generally to the literature and our understanding of students' experiences and their well-being. So a couple of things that are unique to us is that in addition to studying negative indicators of mental health, such as distress, we're also looking at positive mental health as part of our study and really focusing on understanding the factors that may be associated with students' resilience, those ranging from individual level factors, but most importantly, looking at institutional level factors, things that are in the broader campus climate, in the campus community, but also the role of institutional factors, such as LGBTQ2S plus resource centers and such. So for us, it's really an important, exciting study. Our study is guided by a stakeholder group, which represents various sort of sectors, so community and campus-based service providers, also LGBTQ student organizations and LGBTQ2S plus organizations as well, and student organizations such as CFS Ontario and the Undergrad Student Alliance here in Ontario. We're really fortunate to have such a dedicated group working with us. The study does consist of two phases, a quantitative survey, which is what we'll be focusing on today, and also qualitative interviews, which are currently underway. So the survey itself was a significant undertaking, and the survey was conducted last winter, and all LGBTQ2S plus university students in the province were invited to participate. There were several inclusion questions that were asked in the beginning of the survey to ensure that we were getting students who met that criteria. We used various ways to recruit students for the study, everything from social media campaigns to posters displayed on campuses. Some campuses also distributed campus-wide emails and such. Each campus had a champion, a staff person who acted as a champion for the survey, who helped to promote the survey, and we're really appreciative of our champions for their work. The survey was approved by several ethics boards, 18 in total. The students who participated could enter a random draw for 103 gift cards of various amounts. And because we conducted the survey here in Ontario, the survey and all materials were available in both official languages. So in terms of our participants, we have nearly 4,000 students, LGBTQ2S+ identified students from various universities from throughout the province. So this represents the number of people who also passed several quality control questions that were built into the survey to try to foster the highest quality data. And so we have a very large sample, which is quite a positive thing. You can also see from this slide that the sample is quite diverse when it comes to their gender identity, sexuality, but also racialized identities, and also students living with disabilities. If we look at gender in terms of sort of a broad breakdown, we have 29% of our participants who are identified as part of the trans community. And we include genderqueer, trans, feminine spectrum, trans-masculine spectrum, and non-binary, and other diverse gender identities. So we have 71% who identify as cisgender, meaning that their gender identity corresponds with their birth sex. We also have a diverse sample in terms of sexual identities. Some of the larger groups would be 36% identifying as bisexual, 17% identifying as gay, 13% as queer, 12% lesbian, 10% pansexual, and 6% asexual. For both gender identity and sexual identity, we did ask about two-spirit identities, and we do have a small number of students who report those identities when it comes to both gender and sexuality. As I said, we have a racially diverse sample, 24% of students who identify as being racialized. We actually asked race through various ways, including select all that apply. And then a follow-up question was, do you identify as being racialized? So 24% identify as being racialized and 4% identify as being Indigenous students. We have 17% of the students who identify as living with a disability. We also asked about various types of disabilities, but 17% said they identify. And given sort of the demographics of the province, it's not surprising that most of our participants were undergraduate students. So given our time, I'm only going to focus on some selected aspects of the survey and the data. And when we think about campus climate, we ask students to report both their perceptions of the climate for LGBTQ2S+ students and also their experiences. So first, we're going to just turn to a couple of things related to perceptions. So we created some scales or questions, measures to assess their perceptions, and working with a group of students through focus groups, we developed these questions, and then we did a pilot study as well to test how effective they were. And what's important for us is that when it came to asking about experiences and perceptions related to trans students, those questions were only asked of trans students. Questions related to sexuality or LGBTQ students were asked of students who identify as being part of the LGBTQ community. So of course, we have some trans students who also identify as being part of the LGBTQ community, and they could answer those questions as well. Whereas questions related to trans students were only asked of trans students. So that's an important thing for us to understand moving forward. So this table, this is again just selected indicators of the perceptions of climate. This table reports the percentage of students who selected either somewhat agree, or strongly agree to these particular questions. And these are a positive assessment, except for the last two items, the treated unfairly and experiencing barriers, which are negative indicators of climate. So what do we see here? As you can see, fewer trans students positively rated the climate in terms of feeling welcomed and accepted by student staff and faculty compared to their LGBTQ students. When we think about the last two items, though, for the negative indicators of climate being treated unfairly and the perception that they experience more barriers accessing services on campuses, more trans students endorsed these two items compared to LGBTQ students. So if we think about that, it's saying there's important differences for us to understand between trans and LGBTQ students. So going to the next slide. This is also related to students' perceptions of the climate. And this question, though, had to do with feeling comfortable if one did not disclose their identity, so their trans or their LGBTQ identity. And as you can see from the slide, we went from sort of broad campus overall to specific spaces and also some resources. And again, these are just selected pieces of data from the survey. So as per the earlier slide, we see that the climate related to being trans tends to be perceived as being more hostile than for being LGBTQ. So as you can see here, particularly large differences are seen for washrooms, gyms, and locker rooms. So for example, washrooms, 78% of the trans students said, I feel more comfortable if I do not disclose my trans identity, versus 38% of the LGBTQ students who said, I feel more comfortable if I do not disclose my sexual identity. The first question in terms of general campus overall, that's also quite a large difference, with 70% of the trans students saying I feel more comfortable if I don't disclose my identity, and versus 55%. But again, really notable differences are seen between washrooms, gyms, and locker rooms. We also see some differences, of course, when we look at the other items in terms of seeking support services, 43% for trans students versus 27% for LGBTQ students, and health services, 50% versus 32%. Some noteworthy significant differences there for us to be mindful of. So now we're going to turn to some of the experiences of discrimination on campuses. So we're going to start with subtle discrimination, namely everyday microaggressions, which are often unintentional and ambiguous in nature. The survey asked questions specific to trans microaggressions and other questions related to LGBTQ or sexual orientation microaggressions. This slide is presenting the trans ones. Students reported their experiences using a scale from never to very frequently, but here we've simply reporting experiencing at least one incident of the particular form of microaggression. Microaggressions can happen in sort of two formats. One is environmentally, so which would be things such as through institutional practices or in the general environment, sort of the ambient climate, but also through interpersonal exchanges, through direct contact with others. So when we look at the trans environmental microaggressions, we see 87% of the participants reported facing binary forms, and these would be institutional forms used by the university. 73% reported receiving sexual health information that did not acknowledge their trans bodies, so limited to cisgender bodies. 68% feeling that they did not have access to restrooms where they felt, or bathrooms where they felt comfortable as a trans person. So quite a significant sort of stressor when you think about the importance of all of these things in a student's life. When we look at the interpersonal microaggressions, and these are just the most common ones, just saying did it happen or not, we see that nearly 3/4 faced or encountered friends or acquaintances who were transphobic and did not realize it. So they did not realize they were being offensive. Nearly every 7 in 10 students said they experienced being misgendered through incorrect pronouns, and 62% having their experiences minimized when they said they were frustrated by transphobia. So that's sort of like a micro invalidation. So now turning to the LGBTQ microaggressions. Thank you, Simone. So we did a similar kind of analysis where we look at environmental and interpersonal. So turning to the environmental, hearing the phrase "that's so gay" to mean something was negative, stupid, or uncool, 78%, so quite high. 70% of the LGBTQ students reported receiving health information limited to heterosexuals. Also quite common on campuses, hearing the phrase no homo. And 60% reported being on a campus where LGBTQ jokes were okay. So all of these are sort of indicators of the ambient environment and such. Turning to the interpersonal microaggressions, just over 60% reported that they felt that their sexuality was tolerated, but they could not discuss it. So this amongst friends and such. 58% encountered microaggressions where they had experiences that were minimized, and when they said they were being frustrated by LGBTQ biases and prejudice and such. And just over half of the respondents indicated that someone said they could not be homophobic because they have LGBTQ friends, so which is a common microaggression. We also asked about blatant forms of discrimination, which we're calling victimization. And here, all students, regardless of their gender identity, were asked the same question. So we're going to just report data based on trans identity and cisgender students. So, so when we look here, we can see that more trans students experience victimization than their cisgender peers across all of these indicators. Some of the larger differences are certainly being verbally threatened, bullied, and intimidated. We also see, 3-point difference being physically threatened and bullied. We did ask about sexual harassment and assault, and you can see that 12% of the students said in the past year on campus, 12% of the trans students said that they had experienced at least one incident of sexual harassment or assault versus 14% of cisgender. So as you can see, it's slightly higher for cisgender students. So why does this matter? So we study students' perceptions and their experiences because we're interested in students' well-being, and we don't want to just study well-being in their academics alone. We want to try to understand what are the factors that are underpinning this. So our work is guided by many theories. Minority stress theory and intersectionality are two key theories for us. Focusing here on minority stress theory, this particular framework is useful in terms of understanding what contributes to the negative outcomes, the poor well-being in academics amongst LGBTQ2S plus students. What this theory is suggesting is that in addition to the general stressors that all students face, such as the stressors of getting to class on time and working and so on and so forth, because of heterosexism and cisgenderism, that they experience also discrimination, being those distal minority stressors. And they also experience internalized stigma, such as sort of internalizing the negative messages that people hear about their identities, but also anticipating discrimination. For example, when you go into a new space, is this going to be a safe space for me? If somebody has experienced bullying in high school and they're going to go to university, are they thinking, am I going to have the same experiences in university, for example?
Sorry, Michael, for interrupting you. You have kind of 1 minute to wrap up.
Perfect. Can you just jump to, yeah, okay, thank you. So if we just go there. So we did look at several indicators of mental health and academics. And what's most important, if we can go to the, down again, Simone, is this scale here, this finding, this sort of representation, which is basically saying when it comes to these various negative or various outcomes that we've assessed, so distress, psychological distress, mental health, positive mental health, academic disengagement, such as skipping classes, academic stress, perceived intellectual development, and institutional report, that all of these things that we're looking at in terms of the campus climate matter. So that poor perceptions of climate are related to all of these particular outcomes. Similarly, the more environmental microaggressions both trans and LGBTQ students face, similarly with interpersonal and more victimization, that all of these things are contributing to these negative outcomes. So it says that the campus climate really matters. So if we go to the next slide and the next one. Thank you, Simone. For us, we're trying to hopefully through this work, help us understand that if we take a prevention frame by trying to foster inclusion, we can actually then in turn have a positive effect on students' well-being in their academics. And in order to do that, we need to be thinking about lots of policy things, education and awareness, how people relate to one another, their understanding. We also need to work with LGBTQ2S plus students in terms of their feelings of support and belonging. And finally, even if as we work towards changing the climate, we still need to have services that are going to be responsive to LGBTQ students' experiences. So that would include ensuring that they're culturally competent, that there's training, that there's a commitment at all levels of the organization, and that there's a commitment to continual improvement. So that is my last slide, and I will turn it back to you, Simone. Thank you, everybody.